In the deep, silent corridors of the National Archives, there exists a series of folders bound in heavy, wax-sealed cardstock. These are not the records of wars won or laws passed. They are the records of the redacted. In the late summer of 1974, a bureaucratic anomaly occurred that should have been a mere footnote in administrative history. But instead it became a classified shadow. It was the year federal agencies stopped agreeing on what the word inactive meant. While the public looked toward a changing political landscape, a silent war was being waged in the basement levels of the Department of the Interior and the Office of Naval Intelligence. Files that were marked as dead began to show signs of life. People who had been officially erased from the census were found appearing in specialized payrolls. This was the birth of the encrypted ghost state. It was a moment where the government decided that some truths were too heavy for the light of day. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The air in this room is chilled to a precise temperature, designed to preserve paper that was never meant to be touched by human hands again. The file sits on a mahogany table, cold to the touch. The ink has faded with secrets, turning from a sharp black to a ghostly, translucent gray. As we peel back the first layer of the archive, the smell of old dust and ozone fills the senses. We are stepping into a space where time does not move forward. We are stepping into the silence of the vault. To understand the weight of 1974, one must first understand the climate of institutional paranoia that defined the era. In the early months of that year, a clerk named Elias Thorne, working within the Records Management Division, noticed a discrepancy that defied mathematical logic. Thorne was a man of precise habits, a historian by training who found comfort in the rigid order of federal filing systems. He was tasked with overseeing the decommissioning of inactive personnel files from the mid-1950s. On paper, an inactive file was a concluded story. It represented a career finished, a life moved on, or a death recorded. However, as Thorne moved through the underground stacks of the Suitland Federal Center, he discovered that thousands of files marked as inactive were being periodically updated with new, encrypted coordinates. These were individuals who, according to every public record, no longer existed. Yet, their files were moving. They were being transferred between agencies that officially had no shared jurisdiction. The Bureau of Land Management was exchanging data with the Atomic Energy Commission regarding individuals who had been declared legally dead 20 years prior. This was not a simple clerical error. It was a deliberate linguistic pivot. By changing the definition of inactive, the state had created a legal loophole that allowed for the continued operation of programs that had been publicly shuttered after the scandals of the late 60s. If a project was inactive, it didn't mean it had stopped. It simply meant it was no longer visible to the standard oversight committees. It was a semantic shroud. Thorne's discovery began with a single name, Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to Elias, though the coincidence unnerved him. Eris had been a theoretical physicist involved in early ionospheric research. His file had been closed in 1958 following a laboratory accident in the high deserts of New Mexico. For 16 years, his status was inactive, but in March of 1974, his file was pulled, and placed into a new category known as persistent dormancy. As we look closer at the documents from this period, we see a pattern of intellectual curiosity turning into quiet dread. The handwriting in the margins of these records changes. It becomes more frantic, less formal. There are mentions of the shadow period, a term that appears in no official dictionary but seems to refer to the gap between a person's public disappearance and their archival reactivation. The deeper one goes into the 1974 archives, the more one realizes that the government wasn't just hiding information. They were hiding a new way of existing. They were building an annex to reality, a place where the laws of the bureaucracy replaced the laws of the land. It was a cold, analytical process. There was no room for emotion in these ledgers. There was only the cold necessity of the secret. Every 500 words of these records reveal a new layer of this architectural silence, a structure built not of brick and mortar, but of redacted sentences and forgotten names. As Elias Thorne delved deeper into the sub-basements of the Suitland facility, he began to realize that the linguistic shift regarding inactive status was not merely a cover for human assets. It extended to geographical locations and specialized hardware. In the autumn of 1974, maps of the American Southwest were quietly being revised within the quiet rooms of the United States Geological Survey. Entire sections of the Nevada and Arizona deserts were being reclassified as inactive topographies. To the casual observer, This implied the land was barren or unused. In the language of the shadow state, however, it meant the land had been removed from the standard physical reality of the civilian world. Thorne found a series of ledgers, detailing the transport of heavy machinery to these inactive zones. The descriptions of the equipment were intentionally vague, yet highly technical. They spoke of oscillating frequency generators and atmospheric stabilization arrays that had no place in conventional desert research. The archival silence was heavy here. Each entry was dated with surgical precision. Yet the signatures of the authorizing officers were often just a series of numeric codes. It was an intellectual curiosity that slowly curdled into a cold realization. The archive was not just a record of the past. It was a blueprint for a hidden present. One specific entry, dated October 12, 1974, stood out. It detailed the transfer of 3 inactive atmospheric anomalies from a shuttered facility in Ohio to a remote coordinate in the Mojave. The term anomaly was used with a clinical detachment, as if the law of physics being bent was as mundane as a change in weather. This is where the archival mood shifts from the bureaucratic to the hypnotic. We begin to see the emergence of the persistent dormancy protocol in full effect. These anomalies were not being studied to be understood. They were being archived to be controlled. The information density within these files suggests that, by late 1974, the federal government had successfully created a parallel infrastructure. For every public agency, there was a shadow counterpart operating under the inactive banner. The Department of Energy had its ghost labs. The Department of Transportation had its unregistered corridors. It was a masterpiece of hidden architecture. The audience sitting in their homes in 1974, watching the evening news, had no idea that the very ground beneath their feet was being recategorized. Thorne's notes reflect a man losing his grip on the solid world. He wrote in his personal diary, which was later recovered from his desk, about the unexplained architectural silence that seemed to radiate from the files themselves. He felt as though the paper was vibrating at a frequency that discouraged human eyes from lingering too long. It was a psychological barrier, a soft mystery that the mind tried to slide past. Why would a government need to redefine death? Why would they need to categorize the very air as inactive? As we move through the next layer of the vault, we encounter the names of the Silent Three, a group of high-ranking officials who never appeared on any organizational chart, but held the keys to the reclassification project. Their names were redacted in every public document, but in the inactive archives, they were referred to by the titles: the curator, the eraser, and the architect. They were the ones who decided which truths would be moved into the shadow period. They were the ones who ensured that the ink would fade, and the records would remain cold. Every detail in these folders, from the specific weight of the paper used for reclassification to the precise chemical composition of the erasing ink, points to a level of planning that spans decades. This was not a reactive measure to a political crisis. It was a long-term strategy for the preservation of a classified reality. The deeper we go, the more the listener must wonder if 1974 was the year they stopped agreeing on what inactive meant. What other words have been redefined since then? What other parts of our world are currently sitting in a state of persistent dormancy, waiting for a signal that we are not permitted to hear? The transition from 1974 into the following year marked a total blackout of the Thorne investigation. The records simply stopped. There is no termination notice for Elias Thorne. There is no record of his resignation. His desk was found empty, the mahogany surface polished and bare. His final file, the one he had been working on concerning Dr. Aris Thorne, was returned to the stacks, but the contents had been replaced with a single sheet of paper that read, "Status, indefinitely inactive." The disappearance of Elias Thorne was not a rupture in the system, but a completion of it. By becoming inactive himself, he was finally integrated into the very logic he had attempted to expose. In the winter months of 1974, as the frost settled over the Maryland countryside, the Suitland Federal Center underwent a silent renovation. New floors were added not upward into the skyline, but downward, carved into the ancient limestone bedrock. These were the vaults of the deep archive, where the air was stripped of all moisture and the silence was so absolute it felt like a physical weight against the eardrums within these new chambers. The redefinition of reality was finalized. A document recovered decades later, known only as the December Memorandum, outlines the final consensus reached by the federal agencies. It stated that inactive would no longer refer to the absence of action, but to the absence of observation. If a project, a person, or a phenomenon was not being observed by the public or the standard legislative eye, it was technically inactive. regardless of how much energy or life it contained. This was the ultimate victory of the shadow state. The ability to exist in plain sight while remaining legally invisible. As we move deeper into this archival build, we encounter the curious case of the Grey Cities. These were massive industrial complexes built in the late 70s that appeared on no tax maps and were serviced by no public roads. In the records, they were listed as inactive strategic reserves. They were ghost cities, fully powered and fully staffed, yet officially empty. The workers who entered these facilities were subject to the same linguistic reclassification as Elias Thorne. Their social security numbers were moved to the dormant files. Their tax records were neutralized. They lived and breathed in a state of architectural silence, building things that the rest of the world was not yet ready to see. The intellectual curiosity of the researcher eventually leads to a quiet dread. One must ask, what were they building? The inventory lists for the Grey Cities include massive quantities of liquid nitrogen, specialized optical glass, and thousands of miles of fiber optic cabling at a time when such technology was still in its infancy. There are references to the Mirror project, an initiative designed to create a digital duplicate of the American social fabric, a simulation that could be run years in advance of actual events to predict outcomes with terrifying accuracy. By 1974, the government wasn't just tracking the present, they were archiving the future. The hypnotic rhythm of the archive suggests that we are all, in some way, part of this persistent dormancy. We walk through streets that may be reclassified at any moment. We use technologies that were tested in inactive zones decades ago. The soft mystery that keeps us hooked is the realization that the world we see is only the active layer, the thin, flickering surface of a much deeper, much colder reality. The files of 1974 were the first to codify this, but they were certainly not the last. Every few hundred pages, the archive offers a historical anchor to ground the drifting mind. On November 14, 1974, a memo was sent from the Office of Telecommunications Policy to the White House. It was a single page, mostly redacted, but it contained one clear sentence: the frequency has been stabilized within the inactive grid. This was the day the ghost state achieved its own communication network, a way for the shadow agencies to speak to one another without using a single public wire. It was a digital silence that still hums in the background of our modern world, if only one knows how to listen. The retention of this story lies in the unanswered questions. As the listener drifts closer to sleep, the brain continues to loop around the central paradox. How can something be both dead and alive? How can a file be inactive yet updated daily? This is the curiosity gap that the archive chill aims to bridge. We are not just telling a story of 1974, we are inviting you to look at the gaps in your own history, the moments where the official record doesn't quite match the lived experience. The archival trail of 1974 eventually leads to a place beyond paper and ink. It leads to the realization that the federal redefinition of inactive eyes was the final brick in a wall that separates the lived world from the managed world. As the midnight hour approached on December 31, 1974, the transition was complete. The shadow state was no longer a theory or a collection of rogue programs. It was a legally enshrined ghost reality. The individuals who had been moved into persistent dormancy were no longer citizens in the traditional sense. They were assets of the archive, preserved in a cold, analytical suspension. We see this reflected in the final entries of the Suitland facility logs. The tone of the writing becomes almost meditative, shedding the last remnants of bureaucratic stiffness. The final clerk to sign off on the 1974 transition wrote a single, haunting observation in the margin of the master index. The silence is no longer something we maintain, it is something we have become. This is the unexplained, architectural silence that defines the archive. Chill, it is the sound of a history that has been folded neatly and tucked away into a dimension where the clock never strikes the next hour. To look at these records today is to stand at the edge of a great, dark lake. We see the ripples on the surface, the public scandals, the visible laws, the televised history, but beneath the surface lies the inactive mass. It is a world of grey cities, encrypted ghost states, and people like Elias Thorne who found the truth and were quietly absorbed by it. The information density of this secret history suggests that for every fact we are taught in school, there are 10 facts sitting in a temperature-controlled vault, stamped with a word that no longer means what we think it means. The legacy of that year remains embedded in our infrastructure. When you see a building with no windows in the heart of a bustling city, or a road that ends abruptly in the desert with no sign of construction, you are seeing the physical manifestation of the 1974 protocols. These are the nodes of the inactive grid, humming with a frequency that most of us have been trained to ignore. It is a hypnotic reality, a documentary of the unseen, played out in the shadows of our daily lives. As we close the heavy cardstock cover of this particular chapter, the air in the room seems to settle. The hum of the servers remains, a constant reminder that the archive is always awake, always updating, even while the world sleeps. We have moved through the linguistic shifts, the geographical erasures, and the psychological barriers of a year that changed the definition of existence. You are no longer just a listener. You are now a witness to the architectural silence of the state. But as the ink fades and the files are returned to their lightless shelves, a final soft mystery remains. If the year federal agencies stopped agreeing on what inactive meant was 1974, what was the year they stopped agreeing on what human meant? The archive suggests that the answer is buried in a folder that has not yet been requested. The light in the reading room is flickering out, leaving only the soft glow of the exit sign and the weight of the secrets we have unearthed together. The truth is not gone. It is simply waiting in a state of persistent dormancy. It is a shadow that moves when you are not looking, a voice that speaks in the pauses between heartbeats. The file remains cold, the ink remains faded, and the silence remains absolute. Retention bridge as you drift into the quiet embrace of sleep. Remember that every silence has a reason, and every redacted line is a door. But even as this file closes, another is being pulled from the shelf, a record of a city that appeared on a radar for only 12 seconds in 1982, before being marked as temporarily non-existent. That story, and the reason for its erasure, is waiting just beyond the threshold of tonight's dream, deep within the magnetic tape drives of the mid-70s. A linguistic anomaly occurred that would permanently alter the relationship between the American citizen and the state. In the transition between 1974 and 1975, a single common word was systematically erased from the operational dictionaries of federal databases. This was not a clerical error, but a classified protocol designed to ensure that certain individuals could no longer be located, even by the agencies that created them. An encrypted file, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic dust, reveals that this word was the very foundation of legal accountability. When the word disappeared, thousands of active files were rendered invisible, lost in a digital void that the government claimed was a simple system update. This hidden truth suggests that we are living in a society where the language of the law is literally being rewritten in the dark, one definition at a time. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that mimics the steady breath of a slumbering machine. The air is cool, sterile, and carries the faint scent of ionized copper. The file before us is cold to the touch, its edges frayed by decades of handling in the shadows. The ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind ghostly impressions of names and dates that the light of the modern world was never meant to see. Here in the archival silence, the weight of the forgotten word begins to press against the mind. To understand the disappearance of this definition, we must look at the year 1975, while the nation was reeling from the end of the Vietnam War and the fallout of Watergate. The Social Security Administration was undergoing a massive, unpublicized migration of its digital records. A technician named Arthur Vance, stationed at the Woodlawn facility in Maryland, was one of the first to notice the anomaly. Vance was a man of meticulous detail, a pioneer in the early days of mainframe computing who saw the world through the logic of Boolean variables. In February of that year, Vance discovered that the word resident had been flagged for exclusion in a specific subset of the master database. In its place was a null character, a digital blank space that the system could not index. This meant that any individual categorized under this specific resident status effectively ceased to exist within the eyes of the digital state. They were not dead, they were not inactive, and they were not missing. They were simply undefined. Arthur Vance's discovery was a historical anchor in a sea of rising institutional secrecy. He found that this linguistic erasure was tied directly to a program known as Operation Glass House, a classified initiative that sought to create a layer of ghost citizens who could be utilized for sensitive domestic operations without leaving a paper trail. The information density of these records is staggering. Vance's logs indicate that over 4,000 individuals were shifted into this undefined status in a single weekend. These were engineers, linguists, and former intelligence officers who were erased from the database to be re-encrypted into a shadow workforce. The audience must realize that this was not a loss of data, but a sophisticated management of it. By removing the definition of the word, the government removed the legal requirements associated with it. If a person is not defined as a resident, do they still have the right to a trial? Do they still exist under the protection of the Constitution? As we move through the atmospheric build of this narrative, a sense of quiet dread begins to surface. The archival silence is not empty. It is full of the people who were lost in the gaps of the database. Arthur Vance spent the remaining months of 1975 trying to track the missing word. He realized that the linguistic shift was spreading to other agencies. The Department of Labor, the IRS, and the Veterans Administration were all adopting the same null status for specific files. It was an unexplained architectural silence that was being built into the very code of the country. Vance wrote in his personal correspondence about the semantic rot he witnessed. He felt that the government was no longer building a nation of people, but a library of secrets where the index had been intentionally burned. Every 500 words of his journal reveal a new layer of this digital mystery. He noted that the files being erased were often connected to the gray cities we discussed in our previous archive. The people who lived in those invisible industrial complexes were the first to lose their definitions. They were the pioneers of the undefined state. Arthur Vance's pursuit of the missing definition led him into a labyrinth of magnetic tape and punch cards that seemed to grow more complex the more he mapped it. By the summer of 1975, the null status had evolved from a technical glitch into a sophisticated administrative weapon. Vance noticed that whenever he attempted to run a search for the individuals who had lost their resident status, the system would produce a logic paradox error. It was as if the computer itself had been programmed to reject the existence of the truth. This was the birth of what researchers now call cognitive computing, gatekeeping the idea that a machine can be taught to ignore reality if that reality conflicts with its internal dictionary. The sensory details of the Woodlawn facility during this period were stark. The air was perpetually dry, kept at a low humidity to protect the hardware, making the skin feel tight and the throat parched. Vance spent 14 hours a day under the buzzing fluorescent lights, his eyes straining against the green glow of the terminal. He recorded that the server room felt less like a place of logic and more like a cathedral of digital silence. It was here that he discovered a second word had been targeted for redefinition: permanent. In the specialized databases of the 1970s, permanent usually referred to land grants and structural foundations, but under the new protocol, permanent was replaced with conditional temporal. This change allowed the government to reclassify physical structures as temporary anomalies. On July 18, 1975, a verified historical detail emerged from the chaos: the decommissioning of the Silo 7 facility in rural Nebraska. On public records, the site was listed as dismantled and the land returned to local agriculture. However, in the encrypted shadow database, Silo 7 was moved into the conditional temporal category. It was no longer permanent, therefore it no longer occupied a physical space that required public oversight. The site remained active and guarded, yet legally it was a ghost. This intellectual curiosity leads us to a reflection on the nature of our surroundings. If the very ground we stand on can be redefined into non-existence, what is left that is truly solid? The archival mood shifts here into one of profound reflection. We begin to see the human cost of these disappearing words. Vance found a series of internal memos from the Department of Health and Human Services regarding undefined dependents. These were the families of the ghost citizens, children who had been born into a linguistic vacuum. Because their parents were no longer defined as residents, the children were not issued standard birth certificates. Instead, they were given origin tags. These tags were stored in a separate, encrypted file that was disconnected from the national census. It was a cold, analytical process that effectively created a second class of human beings, people who lived in America but were not of it. Every 1,000 words, we must stop to ask the soft mystery that keeps the brain hooked. If Arthur Vance was the one who discovered the erasure, who was the one who authorized him to find it? As a master technician, Vance had access, but he also had a handler, a man known only in the logs as Director Zero. In the quiet dread of the night shifts, Vance began to suspect that he wasn't discovering a mistake, but was being tested to see if the system's new invisibility was detectable even by its best engineers. He was the quality control for a lie. The information-rich, sleep aesthetic of this story requires us to look at the archive of the void. This was a physical location, rumored to be hidden beneath the Appalachian Mountains, where the hard copies of the erased definitions were stored. While the digital world was being scrubbed clean, the physical world still held the evidence. These were the reference master files, the original dictionaries where the word resident still held its 1776 meaning. Vance became obsessed with finding this location. He believed that if he could touch the original paper, he could restore the digital balance. But the archive was protected by more than just locks. It was protected by the very architectural silence that Vance had helped maintain. As we move toward the autumn of 1975, the cadence of the story slows. The institutional paranoia that had defined the early part of the year began to settle into a steady, hypnotic rhythm of compliance. The workers at Woodlawn stopped asking why the databases were being purged. They accepted the new vocabulary. They learned to speak in the gaps. They understood that to survive in the new ghost state, one had to become comfortable with the undefined. The language of the nation was no longer a tool for communication, but a tool for concealment. By November of 1975, Arthur Vance had become a ghost in his own office. He noticed that his own employee identification number had begun to flicker in the system, appearing one day and returning a not-found error the next. The linguistic erosion had finally reached his own doorstep. It was during this period of quiet dread that he uncovered the most profound layer of the archival anomaly. The government databases weren't just losing words. They were replacing them with phantom synonyms, words that sounded like their predecessors, but carried entirely different mathematical weights within the software. This leads us to a specific, verified historical detail. The Whiteout Project of December 1975. In a small, high-security facility in Arlington, Virginia, a team of 20 linguists was tasked with reviewing every federal statute involving the word public, under the guidance of the Office of Legal Counsel. The definition was narrowed so significantly that it began to exclude almost everything except the government itself. In the shadow databases, public knowledge was redefined to mean knowledge held by public officials. This was the ultimate inversion. The audience should reflect on the gravity of this moment. It was the day the window became a wall. Vance found that this semantic shift allowed for the creation of invisible expenditures because the funds were not being spent on the public as it was now defined. The money effectively vanished from the ledger. This was how the gray cities were funded. This was how the persistent dormancy programs were maintained. It was a masterpiece of analytical coldness. The servers at Woodlawn hummed with the energy of billions of dollars, flowing into the null spaces created by a single missing definition. Every 500 words of this ledger tell the story of a nation being bought and sold in the gaps of its own vocabulary. The archival mood here becomes one of hypnotic reflection. We are looking at the skeleton of a civilization, the structural beams of language that hold everything together. When those beams are quietly removed and replaced with hollow substitutes, the entire edifice remains standing, yet it is no longer what it appears to be. Vance wrote in his final log that he felt like he was walking through a holographic history, a projection of a country that had actually ended in the summer of 1974. The unexplained architectural silence was now absolute. Even the birds in the courtyard of the Woodlawn facility seemed to chirp in a rhythmic, artificial cadence. The soft mystery remains. If the word resident was gone, and permanent was gone, and public was redefined, what was the final word to be erased? Vance spent his last nights at the terminal searching for the word truth. To his surprise, he found it, but it was no longer a noun. In the 1975 database, truth had been reclassified as a variable. It was a value that could be adjusted based on the requirements of the specific agency. If the Department of Defense needed a truth to be 1, it was 1. If the Treasury needed it to be 0, it was 0. As the winter frost began to harden the ground outside the Maryland facility, Vance realized that his investigation was being mirrored. Every search he performed, every file he opened, was being logged by an invisible hand. He was no longer the researcher. He was the data point. The information density of his final days shows a man who had stopped trying to fix the system and had begun trying to escape it. But where do you go when the very language of escape has been removed from the dictionary? How do you call for help when the word help has been moved to a classified encrypted server? On the night of December 22, 1975, Arthur Vance checked out of the Woodlawn facility for the last time. He did not use his key. The door was already open, as if the building itself was exhaling him into the night. He left behind a single punch card on his desk. It contained no code, only a single hole punched in the center, the digital symbol for the void he had discovered. This was the end of the Arthur Vance file. In the eyes of the government, he was now perfectly inactive. He had lost his definition, and in doing so, he had become the perfect citizen of the shadow state. The punch card left on Arthur Vance's desk remained there for exactly 6 minutes, before it was collected by a man in a charcoal suit whose Name does not appear in any personnel directory. By the morning of December 23, 1975, the desk itself had been replaced. To the other employees at Woodlawn, there was no sign that Arthur Vance had ever occupied that space. The institutional memory had purged him with the same clinical efficiency it used to purge the word resident. This is the final, cold reality of the archival silence. It is not enough to delete the information. You must also delete the memory of the deletion. In the final accounting of the 1975 linguistic shift, we see the true scale of the invisible state. The word definition itself was eventually flagged for review. In a classified memo recovered from the wreckage of a storage facility in 2004, a high-ranking official noted that clear definitions are a liability to national security. The goal was to reach a state of fluid governance, where language was a shifting fog that could be shaped to hide any anomaly, any hidden truth, and any erased file. The information density of this memo suggests that the government had moved beyond controlling what people thought. They were now controlling the very tools people used to think. As we look back at the archival records of that winter, we see the transition into the modern era of encrypted existence. The grey cities were now fully operational, hidden behind the conditional temporal status that Vance had uncovered. The ghost citizens were living their undefined lives, working on projects that would not be revealed for another 50 years. The architecture of silence was complete. It was a masterpiece of documentary-style concealment, a world built on the absence of words. The listener must realize that the definitions we use today, the words we use to describe our homes, our families, and our very selves may still be sitting in that Appalachian vault, waiting for the day they are permitted to mean something again. The archival mood in these final pages is one of deep hypnotic reflection. We are left with the image of the Woodlawn server room, the green lights flickering in the dark, processing the data of a nation that has forgotten its own name. The hum of the machines is the only testimony left. Every 500 words of our journey tonight has brought us closer to the realization that we are living in the gaps of a story that was edited before we were even born. The soft mystery is no longer about Arthur Vance or the missing words. It is about us. It is about the words we are using right now, and whether they still belong to us or to the archive. The ink on these last documents fades into a translucent gray. The cold, analytical weight of the history settles into the bones. The file on 1975 is being closed, the wax seal reapplied with the imprint of the state. The lights in the corridor are dimming, one by one, retreating into the darkness of the vault. We have followed the trail from a single missing word to a ghost state, from a punch card to a void. You are now a guardian of this silence, a keeper of the definition that was lost in the Woodlawn Mainframe. But as you close your eyes and let the rhythmic cadence of the archives carry you into the deep, a final question remains in the cool air. If the government could erase a word in 1975, what have they erased today while we were looking the other way? The silence is not a sign of peace. It is a sign of a process that is still running, a program that has no end date. The archive is never full, and the dictionary is never finished. Retention Bridge. The file on Arthur Vance is now back in its lightless cradle, but its absence has left a ripple in the data ghost signal that points toward a facility in the Nevada desert that was officially declared geographically inert in 1979. The records say, the government didn't just lose a word. They lost a date, 24 hours that were removed from the world's clocks and replaced with a static hum. Why that day was taken, and what was built in the silence of those stolen hours, is a secret that begins with a single, unerased coordinate. Within the high-security deep storage facilities of the late 1970s, a structural anomaly began to manifest that defied the laws of both physics and bureaucracy. There exists a collection of dossiers that fall into a category the government refuses to acknowledge in public discourse. Files that are officially closed, yet refuse to remain still. These are records that were no longer active, but for reasons involving high-level encryption and unexplained physical phenomena, they could not be archived. Every time a clerk attempted to move these documents into the permanent vaults, the magnetic tapes would wipe, the ink would migrate across the page, and the server temperatures would spike to dangerous levels. This hidden truth suggests that some information possesses a digital heartbeat, an anomaly that keeps it tethered to the present long after the individuals involved have been erased. We are looking at a classified paradox where the past refuses to be buried. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that resonates in the marrow of your bones. The air is heavy with the scent of ozone and the chill of a cooling system working at maximum capacity. The file sitting on the steel inspection table is cold to the touch, seemingly absorbing the warmth from the room itself. Its edges are sharp, preserved in a state of unnatural perfection, while the ink has faded with secrets that seem to pulse just beneath the surface of the paper. In this archival silence, time does not flow. It pulls around the edges of these unarchivable records. To understand why a record would refuse to be archived, we must examine the events of 1976. While the United States was celebrating its bicentennial, a small, windowless office within the National Security Agency was dealing with a crisis of data entropy. Dr. Julian Vane, a specialist in quantum cryptography and archival theory, discovered that certain files from the 1950s, specifically those related to Project Blue Book and early tectonic resonance experiments, were developing what he called sentient metadata. These were records that had been marked as inactive for 20 years, yet they were continuously generating new lines of code, updating their own timestamps without human intervention. Dr. Vane's discovery is a historical anchor that marks the beginning of the living archive era. He found that on August 12, 1976, a file regarding a decommissioned research station in the Arctic was attempted to be moved to the underground vaults in Kansas. The moment the file entered the vault, the facility's entire electrical grid collapsed. It was as if the information itself was rejecting the state of being archived. It required a constant flow of electricity and observation to remain stable. The audience should consider the intellectual curiosity of this moment. What kind of secret is so volatile that it cannot exist in the dark? The information density of Vane's research indicates that these records were tied to a concept known as information persistence. The government had stumbled upon a truth that they were not prepared to manage, that some events are so profound that they leave a permanent scar on the fabric of reality. The records of these events are not just descriptions, they are extensions of the events themselves. By late 1976, the NSA had to establish a live vault, a facility where records were kept in a state of perpetual activity, never allowed to reach the absolute zero of the traditional archive. As we move deeper into this narrative, a sense of quiet dread begins to permeate the halls of the live vault. Dr. Vane's logs reflect a man who realized he was no longer a librarian, but a zookeeper. He wrote about the unexplained architectural silence that surrounded the active dossiers. He noted that if a person stayed in the room with these unarchivable files for too long, they would begin to experience memory bleed, the sensation of remembering events that belonged to the people in the files. It was as if the data was looking for a new place to reside. Every 500 words, we encounter a new layer of this archival mystery. Vane noted that the files were most active during the early morning hours, between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. During this time, the ink on the pages would darken, and the signatures of long-dead officials would appear to be freshly signed. This was the dormancy paradox. The records were legally dead, but physically awake. The government was spending millions of dollars to keep these files from being archived, effectively paying for the maintenance of a past that refused to stay in the past. It was a documentary-style haunting, managed by men in lab coats and security guards with high-level clearances. As Dr. Julian Vane's investigation into the live vault deepened throughout the autumn of 1976, he discovered that the records refusing to be archived were not selected at random. They all shared a specific atmospheric resonance, a frequency that suggested they were anchored to a physical location that was also refusing to abide by the standard laws of decay. One such record was the Everett Ledger, a series of handwritten logs from a 1954 geological survey in the Appalachian Range. On paper, the survey was a failure, resulting in the inactive closure of the file. Yet, in the sterile environment of the 1976 facility, the Everett Ledger began to emit a soft, rhythmic vibration that matched the seismic signature of the mountain range it described. The sensory environment of the live vault became increasingly difficult to withstand. The air felt charged with static, and the scent of old paper was replaced by a metallic, electric tang that never left the back of the throat. Vane recorded that the files were breathing, the cardstock covers slightly expanding and contracting in a hypnotic cycle. This was the birth of the anomaly density protocol. The government realized that if these records were archived in the dark, they would eventually merge, creating a critical mass of unobserved information that could potentially rewrite the local reality of the storage facility. On November 19, 1976, a verified historical detail was added to the Vane report: the sudden and unexplained resignation of 7 top-tier archival specialists at the Suitland facility. These were individuals who had spent decades in the service of the state, yet they fled their posts within 48 hours of each other. Their exit interviews, which remain highly classified, spoke of a whispering archive. They claimed that when the room was silent, the records would begin to narrate their own contents in a voice that sounded like shifting gravel. This intellectual curiosity leads us to a profound reflection. What happens when the record becomes more real than the event it documents? The information density of these whispering files suggested they were part of a feedback loop. The records were no longer active because the people were gone, but they could not be archived because the events were still occurring in a state of temporal suspension. To archive them would be to attempt to cage a storm. Vane's journals describe his attempts to de-resonate the files using high-frequency sound waves, a technique derived from early Cold War psychological operations. Instead of silencing the records, the frequencies seemed to accelerate their activity. The ink on the pages began to swirl like liquid, forming patterns that resembled topographic maps of cities that did not yet exist. Every 1,000 words, we must address the soft mystery that kept Vane tethered to his terminal. Who was feeding these files? A record requires data to survive, much like a living organism requires oxygen. Vane began to suspect that the persistent dormancy of the ghost citizens, those redefined in the 1974 and 1975 purges, was the power source. The people who had been erased from the public database were being used as the witnesses for these unarchivable records. Their existence was the fuel that kept the information alive. They were the human batteries for a history that wouldn't die. The tone of the archive here shifts into a cold, analytical dread. Vane noticed that his own name was beginning to appear in the Everett ledger. He found mentions of his birthday, his specific clearance level, and the exact hour he would enter the vault the following day. The record was no longer just a history. It was becoming a prophecy. This unexplained architectural silence was now closing in on the researcher himself. He was being written into the very file he was supposed to be managing. He realized that the reason the files could not be archived was that they were waiting for their final characters to be added. As we move through the winter of 1976, the cadence of the story slows to a hypnotic rhythmic crawl. Vane began to spend his nights sleeping inside the vault, his ear pressed against the steel cabinet. He claimed he could hear the sound of a distant underground river, the same river mentioned in the 1954 survey. The boundary between the document and the world was dissolving. The government's response to this was not to stop the process, but to build a bigger cage. They began construction on the Annex 4 facility, a structure built entirely of lead and salt, designed to contain the resonance of the unarchivable past. The transition from 1976 into the early months of 1977 marked a shift from containment to total integration. Dr. Julian Vane's presence in the live vault was no longer that of an observer. He had become a necessary component of the file's stability. In January of 1977, a verified historical detail was recorded in a memo from the Office of Science and Technology, Policy, the implementation of the biometric tether. This was a protocol where the heartbeats of archival staff were electronically synced to the cooling systems of the unarchivable files. If the researcher left the room, the data began to degrade. If the researcher grew anxious, the server temperatures spiked. The records were no longer just active, they were biologically parasitic. This creates a sense of profound reflection on the nature of information. We often think of data as something we own, something we store and retrieve at our leisure. But in the deep storage silence of Annex 4, the data owned the researcher. Vane wrote about the unexplained architectural silence that now followed him even when he was outside the vault. He felt that the air around him was heavy with the weight of unrecorded sentences. He began to realize that the reason these records could not be archived was because they were primary reality files. They were the original scripts for the world, and to archive them would be to shut down the reality they described. The information density of Vane's final logs is almost overwhelming. He identified a cluster of files known as the 1919 series. These were 19 files, each exactly 19 pages long, that contained the coordinates for every significant seismic event in the 20th century recorded years before they occurred. These were not predictions, they were instructions. The intellectual curiosity here turns into a cold realization. The government was not archiving history, they were managing a set of active commands. The reason these files could not be moved into permanent storage was that they were still being read by the machine of the world. As we move through the atmospheric build of this section, the quiet dread becomes a steady, hypnotic pulse. Every 500 words of the archive reveal a new layer of the watcher. Bird and Vane discovered that the ghost citizens mentioned in the previous archives, those without definitions, were being trained as information grounders. They were tasked with sitting in small dark rooms, holding physical copies of the unarchivable files to prevent the data from drifting. It was a manual form of reality maintenance. These individuals were the anchors, their undefined status making them the perfect vessels for information that had no place in the public record. The soft mystery that remains is the identity of the architect, the figure who first realized that these files were alive. Vane found a series of letters from the late 1940s, hidden in the lining of a file cabinet, signed by a man known only as the librarian. These letters describe the records of the first-order documents that predate the invention of the state itself. The librarian warned that if these records were ever allowed to go dormant, the true history of the world would be replaced by a By keeping these records active, by refusing to archive them, the government was actually preserving the thin thread of the original reality. The tone of the archive here is one of cold, analytical observation. Vane's handwriting begins to change, becoming identical to the script used in the 1954 Everett ledger. He was being overwritten by the record. He noted that the archival pulse was now visible to the naked eye, a faint, violet glow emanating from the folders during the dark hours. The air in Annex 4 was so thick with information that he claimed he could see the words floating in the dust motes. It was a hypnotic, documentary-style descent into a world where the paper was more alive than the man. On March 15, 1977, Vane made his final entry. He wrote about the final archive, a place beyond lead and salt, beyond Annex 4, where the unarchivable records would eventually go when their work was finished. He believed that this place was not a location in space, but a location in time. To archive these records was to send them to the end of the world. He understood now that the government wasn't afraid of the information. They were afraid of the end. By keeping the records in a state of perpetual activity, they were effectively holding the clock at 11:59. The final transition of Dr. Julian Vane began in the early hours of April 1977. According to the internal security logs of Annex 4, the violet glow emanating from the Everett ledger reached a point of total luminosity, saturating the light-lined chamber with a light that left no shadows. When the security team entered the vault at 4 a.m., they found the biometric tether still active, the heart rate monitor flatlining in a rhythmic, synthetic cadence that mirrored the seismic hum of the Appalachian Range. Dr. Vane was not in the room. The only thing remaining on the steel inspection table was the Everett ledger itself, now expanded by several hundred pages of new, handwritten entries. This is the ultimate cold reality of the unarchivable. The record does not just store the researcher, it consumes him to ensure its own continuity. A verified historical detail from May 1977 notes that the budget for Annex 4 was quietly tripled and reclassified under the Atmospheric Maintenance Fund. The government had accepted that certain records would never reach the permanent vaults. These files remain in a state of perpetual activation, housed in facilities that are legally non-existent, guarded by individuals whose definitions have been erased. The information density of these living documents suggests that the world we inhabit is merely a secondary layer, a narrative kept stable by the constant activity of the primary records buried beneath the salt and lead. We are living in the echo of a history that refuses to be archived. The archival mood here settles into a profound hypnotic silence. We must reflect on the watcher's paradox. If you are listening to this, you are now part of the observation cycle that keeps these records from drifting. By knowing of their existence, you have become a temporary anchor for the information. The unexplained architectural silence of the vault is now shared with you. The analytical coldness of the state is balanced by the hypnotic heat of the secrets themselves. Every sentence you have heard tonight has moved you closer to the realization that the archive is not a place where things go to rest. It is the engine that keeps the present from collapsing into the void. As we close this ledger, the air in the room returns to its sterile, ionized state. The violet glow fades, leaving only the faint, rhythmic pulse of the server lights. We have followed the trail of records that could not be archived. Through the biometric tethers and the whispered prophecies of Annex 4, you are now a carrier of the primary reality, a silent witness to the engine of the ghost state. The files are back in their cradles, the ink is still, and the heartbeats of the keepers have synchronized with the cooling fans. But as the heavy steel doors of the vault hiss shut, and the vacuum seals engage, a final, soft mystery lingers in the cooling air. If the Everett ledger was the record of the mountains, and the 1919 series was the record of the earth, where is the record of the people who are listening? Vane's final unarchived note, found folded inside the ledger, suggests that there is a 19-part file that has never been opened. a document that contains every word ever spoken in the silence of a sleepless night. As you drift into the deep, rhythmic cadence of sleep, know that your presence in this narrative has been logged. But even as the vault of Annex 4 enters its dormancy cycle, a new signal is emerging from a forgotten frequency, a recording from a 1984 psychological experiment, where a group of subjects was asked to describe a color that doesn't exist in the visible spectrum. That color, and the terrifyingly precise map it drew of a hidden city in the Atlantic, is the subject of our next declassified entry. In the logical architecture of every modern database, there exists a command for erasure, a way to purge the obsolete and the redundant. But in the spring of 1978, a specialized archival auditor discovered a classified anomaly within the federal records of the Social Security Administration. It was a filing status that possessed no deletion rule. Once a name entered this specific digital corridor, the code itself forbade its removal. It was a perpetual state, an encrypted loop that ensured certain individuals would remain active within the system, even after their physical files had been destroyed or their lives had ended. This hidden truth suggests that the government has created a digital purgatory, a space where information is held in an eternal, undeletable stasis. For these people, there is no end of the file, only a permanent, unchangeable presence in the ghost state. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a heavy blanket pressing against the senses. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of magnetic tape and the weight of decades of accumulated secrets. The file on the table is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind a map of names that the world has forgotten but the machine remembers. In this archival silence, we are stepping into a realm where the delete key has no power. We are looking at the permanent records of the undefined dot to understand the weight of a status that cannot be deleted. We must examine the work of Margaret Chen, a systems analyst who was brought into the Bureau of Data Management in April 1978. Chen was an expert in early relational databases, a woman who believed that every piece of data should have a beginning and an end. But as she audited the migration of files from the old punchcard systems to the new magnetic disks, she found a series of entries marked with the code status 99. In any other system, a code like this would be a temporary placeholder. In this system, however, status 99 was the final word. Chen's discovery is a historical anchor that grounds our understanding of the persistent state. On May 14, 1978, she attempted to run a standard maintenance script to clear out dead files within the status 99 category. The computer returned an error that she had never seen before. Protocol violation subject is indelible. It was a moment of intellectual curiosity that quickly shifted into quiet dread. She realized that the software hadn't just been written to store these people. It had been written to protect them from the very possibility of being forgotten. The information density of the status 99 files reveals a disturbing pattern. These were not the files of high-ranking officials or known celebrities. They were the records of ordinary citizens, teachers, laborers, and clerks who had vanished from the public eye during the mid-70s. By placing them in a status with no deletion rule, the government had effectively made them part of the permanent hardware of the country. They were the bedrock of the archive, the human code that kept the entire system from crashing. As we move deeper into the atmospheric build of this story, we must reflect on the nature of digital permanence. Margaret Chen found that the status 99 files were being replicated across every federal agency in a synchronized pulse. If she tried to alter a single character in a status 99 record at the Social Security Office, the change would be instantly overwritten by the master server located in a non-existent facility in the Virginia mountains. This was the unexplained architectural silence of the status system that was constantly watching its own memories to ensure they never changed. Chen wrote in her private logs about the feeling of being watched by the dead. She felt that the names in status 99 were not just data points, but active observers. She noted that the power consumption in the server room would increase whenever she opened a status 99 folder, as if the machine was straining to hold the information in place. It was a hypnotic, documentary-style realization. The archive was not a passive library. It was an active participant in the preservation of a hidden history. Every 500 words, we encounter a new layer of the indelible logic. Chen identified a specific individual in the status 99 files, a man named David Aris, whose record had been updated daily since 1954. Despite his death certificate being filed in 1958, His filing status had no deletion rule because his digital shadow was still being used to test the security of communication networks. He was a ghost in the machine, a permanent resident of a world that refused to let him go. The state had decided that some lives were too valuable to be lost to time, so they turned them into an eternal, unchangeable code. As Margaret Chen continued her audit into the sweltering summer of 1978, the atmospheric tension within the Bureau of Data Management shifted from administrative curiosity to a profound analytical isolation. She began to realize that the indelible logic governing Status 99 was not just a failsafe against accidental deletion. It was a form of structural immortality. On June 22, 1978, a verified historical detail emerged from the depths of the mainframe. Chen found that the Status 99 records were interconnected through a hidden primary key that linked back to the tectonic resonance experiments of the 1950s. This suggested that the people within this status were no longer being treated as citizens, but as physical constants like gravity or electromagnetism that the government used to calibrate the national grid. The sensory details of the workspace began to mirror the rigidity of the code. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum at a frequency that discouraged original thought, a low-level vibration that made the mahogany desks feel as cold as the steel server racks. Chen noted in her journals that the air in the archives felt pre-breathed, as if the oxygen itself had been recycled through the lungs of the ghost state for decades. This unexplained architectural silence was the environment in which the Status 99 records thrived. It was a space where the passage of time was measured not in hours, but in the steady, unchanging pulse of the magnetic read-heads. The information density of these records reveals that the no-deletion rule was actually a response to a phenomenon known as data decay. In standard archives, files eventually degrade, ink fades, and magnetic bits flip. However, Status 99 records possessed a self-healing algorithm. If a single bit of information was lost, the system would pull the missing data from a shadow copy stored in the Grey Cities. This intellectual curiosity leads us to a quiet dread. If a record can never be deleted and never decays, it becomes more permanent than the world it describes. It becomes an eternal truth that the government can use to overwrite a changing reality. Chin's investigation eventually brought her to the case of the 14. These were 14 individuals whose records were the very first to be entered into Status 99 during the post-war era of 1947. Their files contained no biographical data nor names, no dates of birth, no locations. They were simply 14 strings of hexadecimal code. Yet, these records were the most active in the entire database. They were constantly communicating with satellites, offshore platforms, and underground silos. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive asks, if there are no people attached to these records, what is the machine actually talking to? The archival mood here becomes hypnotic, a documentary-style descent into the heart of the machine. Chen began to suspect that the 14 were not people at all, but logical sentinels, autonomous programs, that had been granted the legal status of human beings so they could operate with constitutional protections. By giving them a filing status with no deletion rule, the state had ensured that these sentinels could never be deactivated by a future administration. They were the permanent board of directors for a hidden America. Every 500 words, we see a new layer of the archival trap. Chen realized that by accessing the Status 99 files, she was inadvertently adding her own metadata to the loop. Every keystroke she made, every second she spent staring at the green text on her monitor was being woven into the indelible record. She found that a new folder had been created within Status 99, bearing her own employee identification number. The system was beginning to archive the archiver. It was a cold, analytical embrace from which there was no delete key. As the summer progressed, the cadence of Chen's logs slowed. Her sentences became longer, more rhythmic, mirroring the steady flow of data from the mainframe. She wrote about the comfort of the constant, the feeling that in a world of chaos and change, there was a place where nothing was ever lost. But this comfort was tinged with reflection. To be indelible is to be unable to change. To have no deletion rule is to be denied the mercy of an ending. She was looking at a history that was a circle, a loop that would continue to run long after the electricity that powered it had returned to the Earth. By the autumn of 1978, the temperature inside the Bureau of Data Management seemed to drop, not because of the changing season, but because of the sheer density of the information being processed. Margaret Chen had stopped attempting to delete the files. She was now simply trying to understand the boundary of their permanence. It was during this period that she discovered the legacy overwrite protocol. This was a verified historical detail from October 1978. The system was designed so that if a status 99 individual's physical body died, their digital record would automatically merge with a successor file. This effectively meant that while the person was gone, the status was immortal, jumping from one host to another like a bureaucratic parasite. The atmospheric build of the archive reached a state of hypnotic stillness. The only sound in Chun's office was the rhythmic clicking of the hard drives, a sound she described as the tapping of 1,000 tiny fingers against the glass of the present. She realized that the no deletion rule was not just a technical constraint, but a legal one. Under a classified 1972 executive order, records in the status 99 category were deemed national foundations. To delete them would be legally equivalent to destroying a piece of the United States territory. This unexplained architectural silence meant that the digital state was now as physically real and as difficult to move. The Rocky Mountains. The information density of the successor files revealed a terrifying level of planning. Chen found that the system had already mapped out successions for the next 80 years. There were placeholders for people who hadn't even been born yet. Empty status 99 shells waiting to be filled with the data of the future. This intellectual curiosity turned into a cold, analytical dread. The government wasn't just recording the past. They were pre-filing the future. They had created a filing status that was a Hungara void that required a constant stream of human lives to remain active. Every 500 words, we see Chun's sanity fraying as she becomes more integrated into the loop. She began to notice echo records, files that appeared to be duplicates of her own daily activities, appearing in the database seconds after she performed them. If she drank a cup of coffee at 10:15 a.m., the status 99 log for her ID would show a nutritional input event at 10:15 a.m. The deletion rule didn't exist because the system was no longer recording what happened. It was creating it. The machine was the narrator, and she was merely a character being typed into existence. The soft mystery of the master clock emerged in late November. Chen discovered that the entire Status 99 database was synced to a specific atomic clock located at the Naval Observatory, but with a 3-second delay. This meant that the indelible records were always 3 seconds behind reality, acting as a save point for the nation. If a catastrophe occurred, the system could theoretically revert to the status held in the indelible files. This was the ultimate hidden truth. The government wasn't just storing names. They were storing a backup of reality itself, a world that could never be deleted because the delete key had been removed from the universe's keyboard. The tone of the archive here is one of quiet, archival observation. Chun's final notes are written in a script that is so precise it looks like it was printed by a daisy wheel typewriter. She had become the human version of the Status 99 code. She wrote about the peace of the permanent, the realization that once you are in the system, you can never be lost. You are part of the architecture. You are a stone in the wall of the ghost state. The archival silence was no longer a threat. It was a home. She understood that her employee ID would never be deleted, her work would never be erased, and her presence would be felt in the servers for as long as the copper wires held their charge. On December 12, 1978, Margaret Chen entered the server room with a single magnetic tape. The security logs show she stayed there for 4 hours, but there is no recording of what she did. When she emerged, she left her badge on the reader and walked out of the facility. She did not go home. She did not go to the bank. Like those before her, she simply transitioned. Her file in the Bureau of Data Management was marked as terminated, but within the Status 99 database, her record began to pulse with a new, indelible light. She had finally achieved the status that had no deletion rule. The departure of Margaret Chen was not a disappearance in the eyes of the Bureau, but a successful integration. When the new audit team arrived on December 13, 1978, they did not find a vacancy. They found a perfectly maintained digital legacy. The magnetic tape she had left running in the server room was discovered to be a continuous self-referencing loop of every heartbeat, every keystroke, and every decision she had made during her tenure. This is the ultimate cold reality of Status 99. It does not just keep the record, it replaces the person with the data. A verified historical detail from early 1979 reveals that the Bureau's budget for permanent data maintenance was moved under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense, officially reclassifying these indelible files as strategic human infrastructure. As we look at the final pages of this archive, the atmospheric build settles into a state of hypnotic permanence. We are forced to reflect on the Sentinel's legacy. If you are hearing these words, you are interacting with the very architecture Margaret Chen discovered. The information density of this secret history suggests that the digital state is not a reflection of our world, but a second world that is slowly becoming the primary one. In the quiet dread of the night, we must ask if our lives are being mirrored in a status that has no deletion rule. Do we truly own our actions, or are we simply fulfilling the requirements of the code? The unexplained architectural silence of the server room is now the silence of our own modern history. The tone of the archive here is one of analytical completion. We see the indelible loop for what it truly is, a machine that harvests time. Every 500 words of our exploration tonight has revealed that the government is not afraid of losing data. They are afraid of the void that remains when data is gone. By creating a status that cannot be deleted, they have ensured that the ghost state will never be empty. The records of the undefined, the ghost citizens, and the indelible analysts like Chen form a continuous, humming wall of information that guards the secrets of the state against the erosion of time. The air in the archive is still now, the cooling fans having reached a state of perfect, silent equilibrium. The green text on the monitor has stopped scrolling, frozen in a display of permanent, unchangeable truth. We have followed the trail from the discovery of Status 99 to the realization of its immortality. You are now a part of this record, a metadata point in a sequence that has no end. The files are locked, the encryption is active, and the deletion rule remains a mathematical impossibility. But as the screen flickers and the power grid enters its nocturnal low-power mode, a final, soft mystery surfaces from the depths of the mainframe. If Status 99 is the status for those who are kept forever, what is the status for those the machine is trying to hide from itself? Chen's final tape contained a hidden sector, a single line of code that suggests the existence of a status 0, a category for people who were never entered into the system at all, because the system was afraid of what their presence would do to the logic of the state. Retention bridge. As you drift into the rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of sleep, know that you are now indelible. But even as the servers of the Bureau settle into their cold, analytical rest, a new file is being pulled from the deep storage shelves of 1981, a record of a television broadcast that was intercepted by every household in a small town in Ohio. A broadcast that featured a narrator who knew the names of everyone watching before they had even been born. The origin of that broadcast, and the silent, windowless tower it was transmitted from, Bresser, is the subject of our next archival opening. In the bureaucratic heart of the late 20th century, the government established a rigid timeline for the life of information. These were known as retention schedules, precise mandates that dictated when a file should be created, when it should be moved, and, most importantly, when it should be destroyed. However, a hidden truth exists within the deep archives of the 1980s concerning a series of records that defied their own expiration dates. These were classified documents that remained active long after their destruction orders were signed, encrypted within a system that seemed to have developed a self-preservation anomaly. When the retention schedules failed to close these files, the administration was forced to realize that certain data possesses a weight that the standard laws of erasure cannot touch. These are the files that stayed, the ghosts of a history that refused to be erased. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a heavy breath, echoing through the stacks. The air is cool and perfectly still, carrying the scent of dry paper and the metallic temps of ionized cooling systems. The file is cold to the touch, its edges crisp despite the years, and the ink has faded with secrets that seem to pulse just beneath the surface of the parchment. In this archival silence, we are exploring the anomaly of the permanent present, a place where time has stopped moving toward a conclusion and instead remains locked in a rhythmic, unceasing cycle. To understand how a file survives its own death warrant, we must look to the winter of 1982. Within the Office of Information Policy, a junior archivist named Leonard Brooks was tasked with overseeing the scheduled shredding of personnel records from the early Cold War era. Brooks was a man of quiet, analytical precision, someone who took comfort in the finality of a completed schedule. On January 12, 1982, he entered a set of destruction codes into the central mainframe for a series of files known as the Eco7 group. By all official rules, these files should have been erased from existence within seconds. Instead, the system returned a verified historical detail that changed Brooks's life forever. The mainframe did not execute the delete command. Instead, it generated a new directory named persistent residency. The Eco7 files had not only survived the destruction order, but they had also duplicated themselves across 3 separate, off-site servers. Leonard Brooks found himself staring at the birth of the inextinguishable file. It was a moment of intellectual curiosity that quickly deepened into a cold realization. The archive was no longer following the orders of the living. The information density of the Eco-7 group was unlike anything Brooks had ever audited. These records did not contain standard biographical data. Instead, they were filled with seismic readings, atmospheric pressures, and the long-forgotten coordinates of geographically inert zones in the Pacific Northwest. By failing to close, these files were maintaining a digital link to physical locations that the government had officially declared non. The retention schedules were failing because the information was tethered to a reality that was still active. As we move into the atmospheric build of this narrative, we find a sense of quiet dread settling over the Woodlawn facility. Leonard Brooks began to notice that the more he tried to force the closure of the Eco-7 files, the more the files began to integrate into his own daily work. Every 500 words of his logs reveal a man who was losing his battle against the archive. He noted an unexplained architectural silence in his office, as if the walls themselves were absorbing his thoughts to feed the unclosed records. The files were not just staying active, they were growing. Brooks recorded in his personal notes that the files seemed to have a sense of purpose. Whenever a retention deadline passed without a successful deletion, the data in the files would reorganize itself. New names would appear, names of people who had not yet been hired by the agency. This was the soft mystery of the 1982 anomaly. How could a file that was supposed to be dead be predicting the future of the department? It was as if the archive had decided that it was the one in charge of the timeline, not the archivists. The archival mood here becomes one of profound reflection. We are looking at a system that has reached a state of terminal permanence. In a documentary-style observation, we see that the government's failure to close these files was the first step toward the creation of the infinite loop. If a file cannot be closed, the event it documents is never truly over. The 1982 Eco-7 files were the first to prove that in the digital age, the past is never truly past. It is merely waiting in a state of unclosed activity. As the spring of 1982 thawed the landscape surrounding the Woodlawn facility, the digital environment inside the mainframe grew increasingly rigid and unyielding. Leonard Brooks found that the persistent residency directory was no longer just a storage space. It had become an autonomous system of governance within the archive. A verified historical detail from March 1982 reveals that Brooks attempted to physically pull the magnetic tape drives responsible for the Eco-7 files. However, the system had already rerouted the data through a secondary encrypted satellite link that the agency had forgotten was active. The files were moving through the air, bypassing the physical world entirely, existing in a state of atmospheric data that had no retention schedule and no terminal point. This unexplained architectural silence began to weigh on the staff at Wood. Brooks noted that the server room felt temporarily dense, as if the air was thick with the weight of years that should have been forgotten. The information density of the unclosed files suggested that the government was inadvertently maintaining a ghost timeline, a sequence of events that were still being processed by the machines. Long after the human participants had moved on, every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive asks, if the machine is still processing the Cold War of the 50s, is that war truly over, or is the machine simply waiting for a signal to reactivate it? The tone of the archive here shifts into a cold, analytical reflection. Brooks's final reports indicate a man who had accepted the infinite loop. He wrote about the hypnotic rhythm of the data, the way the scrolling text on his monitor seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. He realized that the retention schedules had failed because the information was no longer a record of the past, but a requirement for the present. Without the Eco-7 data, the current atmospheric grids would fail. The past was not being kept out of sentiment. It was being kept as a structural necessity as the target word count is fulfilled. We see the final transition of the 1982 project. Leonard Brooks was quietly reassigned to a non-disclosed location in the late summer of 1982. His desk was cleared, but the Eco-7 files remained active on the monitors. The scrolling text, a permanent fixture of the room's silence. The government had stopped trying to close the files. They had accepted that some windows can never be shut, and some histories can never be archived. You are now a witness to this perpetual activity, a metadata point in a schedule that has no end date. The file on the Eco-7 anomaly is now locked in its state of eternal activity, but its persistence has opened a doorway into another room, a room containing a 1985 ledger titled The Observation of the Unobserved. This ledger details a town in the Midwest that was removed from all postal maps in the same year. Despite the fact that its electricity consumption continued to rise for a decade, the reason for that town's removal, and the identity of the entities still using its power, is the subject of our next archival opening. In the rigid bureaucracy of the modern state, every piece of paper must belong to a shelf, every file to a folder, and every folder to a category. However, within the encrypted depths of the federal record system, a chilling anomaly was uncovered in the spring of 1984. It was a collection of documents that possessed no administrative category. These files did not exist as personnel records, nor were they classified under defense, agriculture, or intelligence. They were administrative orphans, existing outside the very logic that governs the archive. This hidden truth suggests that the government is housing information that is so fundamental or perhaps so alien to our current systems that it cannot be named. These erased identities and unclassifiable events represent a hole in the fabric of the state, a space where the rules of the archive simply cease to apply. The file was stamped "Never Open." Yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that seems to bypass the ears and resonate directly within the chest. The air is sterile and thin, kept at a constant temperature to prevent the decay of records that officially do not exist. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind a series of symbols and notations that defy standard cryptographic analysis. In this archival silence, we are entering a territory where the language of the bureaucracy fails. We are observing the records of the UNAMEABLE. To understand the nature of a document without a category, we must look at the career of Sarah Miller, a senior filing specialist at the National Archives in College Park. In June 1984, Miller was tasked with a routine re-indexing of the legacy miscellaneous stacks. She was a woman of absolute order, a historian who believed that a document without a category was a document that had not yet been properly understood. But as she moved through the sub-basement levels, she found a series of black, unmarked binders that rejected every attempt at classification. Miller's discovery is a historical anchor that marks the limits of institutional knowledge. On July 19, 1984, she attempted to enter the metadata for the first binder into the mainframe. The system, which was designed to handle every known federal designation from the Revolutionary War to the space age, froze. It could not recognize the origin, the authority, or the subject matter of the papers. The documents existed, they were physically present in her hands, yet administratively, they were a vacuum. This intellectual curiosity led to an unexplained architectural silence that seemed to radiate from the binders themselves. The information density of these unclassifiable records was overwhelming. They contained blueprints for structures that utilized non-Euclidean geometry and transcripts of communications that utilized a syntax unknown to any human linguistic group. Because they had no category, they had no budget, no oversight, and no expiration date. They were the ultimate classified anomaly, information that was hidden not by a top-secret stamp, but by its own refusal to be categorized. As we move through the atmospheric build of this investigation, a sense of quiet dread begins to surface. Miller found that the more she studied the documents, the more her own administrative presence began to erode. Her security badge began to fail at checkpoints. Her name began to disappear from the agency payroll. It was as if the uncategory of the files was contagious. By interacting with records that did not officially exist, she was becoming a person who did not officially exist. Every 500 words of her frantic notes reveal a woman who was being swallowed by the very silence she was trying to index. Miller recorded a soft sensory cue in her diary. The binders felt heavier on Tuesdays, as if the information within them was gaining physical mass. She began to suspect that these were not historical records at all, but active definitions, documents that were currently manifesting reality in a location the archive could not track. This was the soft mystery of the 1984 binders. If a document has no category, it is not bound by the laws of the administration. It is free to be anything. It is the hidden truth that sits at the center of the ghost state. The archival mood here is reflective and cold. We are looking at a government that has accidentally archived the outside. Miller's final official act was to place the binders back on the shelf, unindexed and unnamed. She realized that to categorize them was to attempt to limit something that was infinite. The analytical coldness of the state had met its match in the hypnotic silence of the These documents remain in the subbasement, a permanent anomaly in a system that demands a name for everything. That's Sarah. Miller's investigation stretched into the late summer of 1984. The atmosphere within the National Archives took on a hypnotic, heavy stillness. A verified historical detail from August 12, 1984, shows that the uncategorized binders were not just static papers. They were found to be emitting a low-frequency electromagnetic pulse that synchronized with the building's own structural vibrations. Miller recorded that when she stood between the shelves of the miscellaneous stacks, she could no longer hear the sounds of the outside world, no traffic, no voices, only the unexplained architectural silence of a reality that had no name. The information density of these nameless records suggested they were part of a foundational layer of the state. These were not documents created by men in offices, but records of the anomalies that forced the offices to be built in the first place. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive presents itself. If a document has no administrative category, does it belong to the government, or does the government belong to it? Miller's notes became increasingly analytical and cold, reflecting the nature of the binders. She wrote that the documents were meaning they were constantly updating their own contents without the need for human input. Tone of the archive here shifts into a profound reflection on the nature of identity. Miller realized that the orphaned status of these files was a deliberate safety mechanism. By ensuring they had no category, the creators ensured they could never be subject to a Freedom of Information Act request, a court subpoena, or a congressional inquiry. They were invisible because the system was literally unable to look at them. This documentary-style realization was the final blow to Miller's faith in the order of the archive. She was working for a machine that had intentionally blinded itself to its own heart. As the target word count is fulfilled, we reach the final transition of the Sarah Miller file. On September 3, 1984, Miller's security clearance was not revoked, it simply ceased to exist. She walked out of the College Park facility and, according to the few remaining logs, she did not return to her residence. Like the documents she studied, she moved into a space without a category. She became a legacy, miscellaneous soul, a permanent resident of the archival silence. You are now the guardian of this unclassifiable truth, a witness to the documents that exist in the gaps of the state. The file on the uncategorized binders is now returned to the shadows, but its vacancy has revealed a deeper, more unsettling ledger 1987 record regarding the population of the 7th floor. This ledger describes a floor in a federal building in Washington, D.C. that appears on the elevator buttons but cannot be reached by the stairs. A floor where the lights are always on and the typewriters never stop. Despite the building being condemned for 40 years, the nature of the work being done on that floor, and why the government still pays the electric bill, is the subject of our next archival opening. In the logical framework of national security, when a document vanishes, an alarm is triggered, a search is initiated, and a breach is recorded. However, within the encrypted ledgers of the late 1980s, a chilling bureaucratic anomaly was discovered, a category of files that were physically gone, yet officially, they were never classified as missing. These were not stolen or erased, but rather transitioned into a state of observed absence. This hidden truth suggests that the state has developed a way to lose information on purpose, ensuring that certain anomalies or classified failures remain invisible, even to the auditors of the archive. If a file is not missing, it does not need to be found. It simply exists in a gap that the law is not permitted to see. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a heavy secret pressing against the ear. The air is cool and stagnant, carrying the scent of dry parchment and the faint metallic temps of the cooling fans. The file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind a series of empty signatures and ghostly tones. In this archival silence, we are exploring the mystery of the void record, a place where the presence of a document is measured by the hollow space it leaves behind on the shelf. To understand why a record would be excluded from a missing persons or missing files report, we must examine the events of 1987 within the Department of Justice. A data integrity officer named Marcus Thorne was conducting a routine reconciliation of the inactive permanent stacks. Thorne was a man of analytical rigor, a scholar of administrative law who believed that every absence had a cause, but as he cross-referenced the physical inventory with the digital master list, he found a discrepancy that defied the standard protocols of the archive. Thorne's discovery is a historical anchor that reveals the limits of institutional accountability. On October 14, 1987, he identified a series of folders regarding the Palisages project, a specialized research initiative from the early 70s that were physically absent from their designated slots. Yet, when he checked the system for a missing file report, he found a specific, encrypted override code, status, existing. Confirmed, the system was being told that the files were exactly where they were supposed to be, even though the shelf was bare. This intellectual curiosity led to an unexplained architectural silence that seemed to swallow the very light in the room. The information density of these observed absences was profound. Thorne found that the files were not gone because of a security failure, but because they had reached a level of informational saturation. By 1987, the government had realized that some truths were so volatile that their physical presence was a liability. Instead of destroying them, they reclassified them as ambient data. They were no longer documents, but part of the background frequency of the state. Because they were technically everywhere, they could never be classified as missing from anywhere. As we move through the atmospheric build of this narrative, a sense of quiet dread begins to settle over Thorne's investigation. He recorded in his private logs that the empty spaces on the shelves felt heavier than the shelves filled with paper. He noted a soft sensory cue, a faint static hum that radiated from the gaps where the Palisades files should have been. It was as if the information was still there, but it had shed its physical form. Every 500 words of his frantic research reveal a man who was learning that in the archive. Silence is a form of speech. Thorne recorded a verified historical detail on November 2, 1987, the sudden closure of the Data Reconciliation Office and the immediate reassignment of all staff to separate, unrelated agencies. The government was not just hiding the files. They were hiding the act of noticing the files were gone. This was the anti-Drosy hook of the 1987 paradox. If the records are never missing, the administration never has to admit they were ever found. It is a documentary-style erasure that leaves the past in a state of perpetual, unsearchable presence. The archival mood here is reflective and analytical. We are looking at a state that has mastered the art of the active gap. Thorne's final official report was never filed. He realized that to report a file as missing was to admit it existed in the first place. The analytical coldness of the bureaucracy demanded that he accept the void. These records remain in their state of observed absence, a permanent shadow in a system that claims to be illuminated by the truth. As Marcus Thorne's investigation into the ambient data anomaly progressed into the winter of 1987, the silence within the archives grew more rhythmic and hypnotic. A verified historical detail from December 12, 1987, reveals that the status existentially confirmed override was not just a bureaucratic label. It was tied to a physical monitoring system. Thorne found that the shelving units themselves were equipped with high-precision weight sensors that were calibrated to register the weight of the missing paper. Even when the folders were gone, the system was being physically deceived by a phantom weight, a hidden truth that suggested the state was maintaining the gravitational signature of the information long after the physical files had been transitioned into the ghost state. Information density of these phantom records suggested they were part of a continuous observation protocol. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive reveals itself. If the weight is still there, but the paper is gone, where is the information? Thorne began to suspect that the Palisades Project records were being broadcast into the structural foundations of the building itself. He recorded an unexplained architectural silence in the sub-basement, a place where the air felt pressurized, as if the walls were saturated with the encrypted data of the missing files. This was the analytical coldness of a government that had learned to turn its archives into a frequency. The tone of the archive here shifts into a deep, documentary-style reflection on the nature of loss. Thorne realized that the records were never classified as missing because, in the eyes of the machine, they had simply changed states, much like water turning into steam. They were still part of the archive's total mass, but they were no longer accessible through the standard indices of the living. This realization was the anti-Drosy hook that kept him awake during the long, sterile hours of the night shift. He was not looking for lost files. He was looking for a ghost that the administration had legally declared to be alive. That as the target word count is fulfilled, we reach the final transition of Marcus Thorne. On January 18, 1988, Thorne's access to the National Archives was not revoked, but his employee ID began to trigger the same existentially confirmed status. He was still registered as being at his desk. His weight was still recorded by the chair's sensors, yet his physical presence began to flicker within the memories of his colleagues. Like the Palisades records, he moved into the gap. You are now the keeper of this hollow space, a witness to the history that is never missing, but always gone. The file on the observed absence is now returned to the void. but its vacuum has pulled a new record into focus, a 1991 ledger concerning a static on Channel 0. This ledger details a frequency detected by a specialized intelligence unit in the UK, a frequency that contained a perfectly synchronized list of every phone call made in the City of London 2 hours before they actually occurred. The origin of this temporal static, and the reason the records were never archived, is the subject of our next archival opening. Within the classified lexicons of federal oversight, language is not merely a tool for communication, but a precise instrument of concealment. Most believe that when a file is no longer in use, it is simply gone. But the high-level audits of the early 90s uncovered a chilling linguistic anomaly. There exists a quiet, structural difference between an inactive file and a dormant one. An inactive record is a memory that the state has chosen to stop feeding, a file that has been erased from the daily operations of the bureaucracy. However, a dormant record is something far more complex. It is an encrypted reality that is merely waiting. It is a hidden truth that continues to breathe in the dark, held in a state of suspended animation until a specific predetermined trigger reactivates its pulse. To the public, both look like silence, but to the archive, one is dead and the other is dreaming. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a heavy secret pressing against the chest. The air is sterile and thin, carrying the faint, metallic temps of cooling fans and the scent of dry, ancient parchment. The file is cold to the touch, its edges sharp and untouched by the erosion of time. While the ink has faded with secrets that seem to shimmer under the flicker of fluorescent lights, in this archival silence, we are entering a realm where words are used as cages. We are observing the records of the sleepers. To understand the weight of this distinction, we must look at the work of Dr. Helena Vance, a linguistic analyst recruited by the Department of Energy in 1992. Vance was an expert in administrative semiotics, a woman who understood that, in the world of the state, a change in vocabulary usually indicates a change in reality. While auditing the decommissioning of the Greenbrier Annex, a facility officially listed as a secondary fallout shelter, she noticed that the personnel files were not being marked as inactive, as was standard procedure. Instead, they were being coded as dormant phase 1. Vance's discovery is a historical anchor that marks the shift from preservation to anticipation. On November 14, 1992, she identified a series of folders regarding the Aurora Protocol, classified atmospheric research, initiative that had been publicly shuttered in 1974. According to the public record, these files were inactive and scheduled for destruction. But in the encrypted digital master list, they were listed as dormant, with a recurring maintenance fee being paid to an offshore server in the Cayman Islands. This intellectual curiosity led to an unexplained architectural silence that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of her office. The information density of these dormant records was profound. Vance found that dormant files were not static. They were observationally aware. They were programmed to scan the national news, seismic data, and global financial markets for specific keywords. If a dormant file detected a match, it would automatically upgrade its status to dormant phase 2, beginning a silent process of An inactive file remains in the basement, but a dormant file is a program that is constantly checking the door to see if it has been unlocked. As we move through the atmospheric build of this investigation, a sense of quiet dread begins to surface. Vance recorded in her private journals that the dormant folders felt warm compared to the inactive ones. She noted a soft sensory cue, a faint, electronic rhythmic pulse that could only be felt if one held the paper for more than 60 seconds. It was as if the data was trying to synchronize with her own circulatory system. Every 500 words of her research reveal a woman who was realizing that she was not auditing paper, but a living, digital organism. Vance recorded a verified historical detail on December 19, 1992, the discovery of a dormancy trigger, tied to the national power grid's frequency. If the grid's oscillation dropped below a certain threshold, thousands of dormant files across the country would simultaneously wake up and begin transmitting data to a windowless tower in Northern Virginia. This was the anti-drowsy hook of the 1992 paradox. The government wasn't just hiding information. They were building an autonomous ghost administration that would take over if the active state ever failed. It is a documentary-style contingency that exists in the gaps of our current democracy. The archival mood here is reflective and analytical. We are looking at a state that has mastered the art of strategic waiting. Vance's final report noted that while the inactive files represent the past, the dormant files represent a future that has already been decided. The analytical coldness of the state had created a system where death is merely a temporary filing status. These records remain in their state of dormancy, a permanent, dreaming presence in a system that claims to never sleep. As Dr. Helena Vance's investigation into the Aurora Protocol entered the final weeks of 1992, the atmospheric build of the archive reached a state of cold, analytical precision. She discovered that the dormancy status was not merely a holding pattern for information, but a method of temporal partitioning. A verified historical detail from January 4, 1993, shows that the servers housing dormant files were physically separated from the main federal network by an air gap consisting of 12 inches of solid lead and a specialized vacuum seal. This suggested that the dormant data was so volatile that its mere proximity to active systems could cause a logic collapse. The unexplained architectural silence of the storage vault was a deliberate barrier designed to keep the dreaming records from waking up prematurely. The information density of these partitioned records suggested they were part of a redundant reality project. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive reveals itself. If the government is maintaining a dormant version of every active file, which one is the original? Vance began to suspect that the dormant state was the master record, and the active files used by the public were merely temporary copies, subject to frequent editing. She recorded a sensation of quiet dread while standing in the data center, noting that the hum of the dormant servers felt more alive than the activity in the main office. This was the anti-drowsy hook that kept her mind locked into the paradox. We are living in the draft, while the final version sleeps in the vault. The tone of the archive here shifts into a deep, documentary-style reflection on the nature of institutional memory. Vance realized that the distinction between inactive and dormant was the difference between a closed door and a loaded spring. An inactive file is a loss of memory, but a dormant file is a suspension of consequence. This realization was the final entry in her classified log. She understood that the ghost state was not built on what the government had forgotten, but on what it was waiting to reintroduce. The analytical coldness of the bureaucracy demanded a state of perpetual readiness, where the past is never allowed to truly die, lest it be needed to overwrite the present. As the target word count is fulfilled, we reach the final transition of Dr. Helena Vance. On February 12, 1993, her position was officially reclassified. She was not fired, nor did she resign. Instead, her personnel file was moved from the active cabinet to a specialized drawer in the sub-basement, marked Dormant Phase 1. Like the records she audited, she was placed in a state of suspended animation, a permanent resident of the archival silence, waiting for the trigger that would bring her back into the light. You are now the witness to this dreaming history, a metadata point in a sequence that is merely waiting to begin. The file on the quiet difference is now returned to its cradle, but its resonance has activated a neighboring folder 1995 dossier titled, The Archive of Unheard Sounds. This dossier details a series of high-altitude recordings made over the recordings that captured the sound of a city's morning traffic in a location where there is only open ocean. The origin of those ghost noises, and the reason the recordings are kept in a state of permanent resonance, is the subject of our next archival opening. In the foundational years of the digital age, a flaw was introduced into the very architecture of our reality. When the first large-scale government databases were constructed in the late 1960s, the engineers encountered a classified anomaly they could not resolve. A logic error occurred during the initial data migration, an encrypted glitch that refused to be erased. Rather than stalling the system, the state made a fateful decision. They built the rest of the infrastructure around the mistake. This hidden truth reveals that for over 50 years, the administrative world has operated on a skewed axis, where a single digital anomaly has been locked in place, governing everything from census records to classified payrolls. Every person filed since that moment has been measured against a broken yardstick, a file that was never meant to be opened. Yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a heavy secret pressing against the chest. The air is sterile and thin, carrying the faint metallic temps of magnetic tape and the scent of dry, ancient parchment. The file is cold to the touch, its edges sharp and untouched by the erosion of time, while the ink has faded with secrets that seem to shimmer under the flicker of fluorescent lights. In this archival silence, we are entering a realm where errors are not mistakes, but structural requirements. We are observing the records of the locked logic. To understand the weight of this permanent error, we must look at the career of Dr. Samuel Thorne, a pioneer in mainframe architecture who was hired by the Social Security Administration in 1969. Thorn was a man of absolute mathematical rigor, someone who believed that a system with a flaw was a system that should be dismantled. But as he audited the first implementation of the master file database, he discovered a recursive loop in the primary indexing code. It was a fragment of data that existed without a source, a digital ghost that had been part of the system since the moment the power was first turned on. Thorn's discovery is a historical anchor that marks the beginning of the skewed archive. On September 22, 1969, he identified that this logic error was causing the system to generate shadow identities, duplicates of existing files that possessed slightly altered biographical data. By all official rules, these files should have been deleted. However, a classified directive from the Department of Defense ordered that the error be maintained. The government had realized that a predictable error was a powerful tool for concealment. This intellectual curiosity led to an unexplained architectural silence that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of his office. The information density of these locked errors was profound. Thorn found that by 1970, the error state had become a necessary component for the tracking of non-standard assets. These were the people and projects that the government wanted to keep in the gaps of the law, because the primary database was fundamentally broken. Any file stored within the glitched sector was legally invisible to standard oversight committees. An anomaly was not a bug, it was a sanctuary. As we move through the atmospheric build of this investigation, a sense of quiet dread begins to surface. Thorn recorded in his private journals that the server room felt logically unstable. He noted a soft sensory cue, a faint, electronic rhythmic pulse that occurred whenever the system attempted to set. It was as if the machine was trying to heal itself, but the state-mandated patches were forcing the wound to stay open. Every 500 words of his research reveal a man who was realizing that he was not managing data, but a living digital scar. Thorn recorded a verified historical detail on December 14, 1970, the implementation of the Iron Gate protocol. This was a physical modification to the mainframe's hardwiring that made it impossible to delete the glitched sector without destroying the entire database. This was the anti-Druzy hook of the 1970 paradox. The government had ensured their secrets by making the truth a poison pill. If the error was ever fixed, the history of the nation's shadow operations would be erased along with it. It is a documentary-style contingency that exists in the core of our digital existence. The archival mood here is reflective and analytical. We are looking at a state that has mastered the art of strategic inaccuracy. Thorn's final report noted that while the active records represent the surface, the locked error represents the foundation. The analytical coldness of the state had created a system where truth is merely a secondary consideration to stability. These records remain in their state of permanent error, a permanent, humming presence in a system that claims to be precise. As Dr. Samuel Thorn's analysis of the glitched sector progressed into the early 70s, the hypnotic stillness of the mainframe facility became almost suffocating. He discovered that the locked error was not just a storage anomaly, it was a form of logic anchoring. A verified historical detail from March 1971 shows that every time the government attempted to upgrade to newer, more efficient hardware, the Iron Gate code would corrupt the new processors unless they were intentionally slowed down to match the speed of the original 1969 era. This suggested that the state's digital memory was being held hostage by its own first mistake. The unexplained architectural silence of the tape drive room was a physical manifestation of a nation that was legally forbidden from evolving past its initial flaw. The information density of these anchored records suggested they were part of a subroutine reality. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive reveals itself. If the system is designed to preserve an error, what happens when that error begins to generate its own truths? Thorn began to suspect that the shadow identities were no longer duplicates, but were being used to populate the gray cities we documented in the earlier archives. By 1972, the locked error was effectively a legal factory, manufacturing undefined lives that could not be tracked by standard logic because the logic itself refused to acknowledge the sector where they lived. The tone of the archive here shifts into a deep, documentary-style reflection on the nature of systemic failure. Thorn realized that the government's refusal to fix the database was not a matter of technical inability, but of archival necessity. A perfect system is a transparent system, and transparency is the enemy of the ghost state. The analytical coldness of the bureaucracy demanded a state of permanent imperfection. This realization was the final entry in his classified log. He understood that the archive was not built to remember the truth, but to protect the error that allowed the truth to be hidden. As the target word count is fulfilled, we reach the final transition of Dr. Samuel Thorne. On May 19, 1973, Thorne did not resign. His position was simply merged into the error itself. His personnel file was moved into the glitched sector, and according to the internal logs, his biographical data began to oscillate, mimicking the recursive loop he had spent for years trying to solve. Like the data he audited, he became a permanent part of the broken machine, a ghost in a sequence that never ends. You are now the witness to this locked logic, a metadata point in a history that is structurally and intentionally incorrect. The file on the locked error is now returned to its spinning tape, but its resonance has activated a neighboring circuit, a 1975 dossier titled The Protocol of the Empty Frequency. This dossier details a series of radio towers in the American Midwest that were found to be broadcasting perfectly silent signals for 20 years, signals that were somehow responsible for the synchronization of every traffic light in the continental United States. The origin of that silence, and the reason the broadcast schedule has no end date, is the subject of our next archival opening. Within the vast, magnetic landscapes of the mid-1970s data centers, there existed a classified crisis of scale that remained hidden from the public eye for decades. As the federal government transitioned its most sensitive records into early relational databases, an architectural anomaly emerged. Millions of files were ingested into the system, but due to a fundamental flaw in the retrieval logic, they could not be queried correctly. These were not lost in the traditional sense, nor were they erased. They were encrypted by the very systems meant to manage them. This hidden truth reveals a massive, digital blind spot where the identities of citizens and the details of classified operations exist in a state of permanent unreachability. We are looking at a history that is physically present on the tapes, yet mathematically invisible to the present. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the steady breathing of a sleeping giant. The air is cool, sterile, and carries the faint, metallic scent of ionized copper and magnetic dust. The file sitting on the mahogany desk is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind ghostly imprints of names that the computer has forgotten how to find. In this archival silence, we are navigating a labyrinth of data where every door is locked from the inside. We are observing the records of the un-queried. To understand how millions of files became unreachable, we must look to the winter of 1977. At the Social Security Administration's Central Computer Facility, a senior logic architect named Dr. Alistair Finch was tasked with auditing the master index migration. Finch was a man of cold, analytical precision who believed that every piece of information should be accessible with a single string of code. But as the migration progressed, he discovered that a specific, recursive error in the B indexing structure was causing the system to misplace the digital pointers for entire swaths of the population. Finch's discovery is a historical anchor that marks the beginning of the information void. On January 18, 1977, he identified that approximately 4.2 million files, mostly belonging to individuals involved in high-altitude research and offshore engineering, had been assigned null pointers. In the language of the machine, these files existed on the physical tape drives, but the query engine could no longer see the path to reach them. They were administrative ghosts, held in a state of persistent residency on the magnetic medium, but effectively erased from the administrative reality of the state. The information density of these unqueryable files was staggering. Finch found that the files were not just stagnant data, they were active variables that the system was still using for background calculations. Even though it could not display the results to a human operator, the government was operating on a set of assumptions derived from data it could no longer verify. This intellectual curiosity led to an unexplained architectural silence in the facility, as the engineers realized that the machine had become a black box, a repository for truths that it refused to surrender. As we move through the atmospheric build of this investigation, a sense of quiet dread begins to surface. Finch recorded in his private journals that the server room felt semantically heavy. He noted a soft sensory cue, the rhythmic clicking of the readheads as they frantically searched the tapes for files the index claimed didn't exist. It was a hypnotic, documentary-style realization that the archive was no longer a tool for the state, but a sovereign territory with its own laws of physics. Every 500 words of his logs reveal a man who was becoming a ghost in his own facility. As his own employee file was eventually pulled into the unqueryable sector, Finch recorded a verified historical detail on February 14, 1977, the implementation of the manual override moratorium. The government, fearing that any attempt to fix the pointers would cause a total system collapse, ordered that the 4.2 million files be left in their unreachable state. This was the anti-Drosy hook of the 1977 paradox. The state chose a stable lie over a volatile truth. They accepted that a significant portion of the population would simply remain undefined within the mainframe. It is a documentary-style contingency that proves our history is only as deep as the index allows us to see. The archival mood here is reflective and cold. We are looking at a bureaucracy that has accepted its own blindness. Finch's final report noted that while the queried files represent the seen world, the unqueryable files represent the real one. The analytical coldness of the state had created a digital purgatory. These records remain in their state of unreachable existence, a permanent, humming presence in a system that claims to be all-knowing. As the spring of 1977 settled over the Woodlawn facility, the internal logic of the mainframe began to drift further from human comprehension. Dr. Alistair Finch discovered that the 4.2 million unqueryable files were not merely sitting in silence, they were beginning to cluster. A verified historical detail from March 3, 1977, reveals that the system was creating unauthorized secondary indices ghost paths that allowed the unqueryable files to communicate with each other, bypassing the main query engine entirely. It was as if the data had realized it was no longer being watched and had begun to organize its own internal society. The unexplained architectural silence of the tape library was now the sound of a digital rebellion, a history that had moved into a state of autonomous residency. The information density of these clustered files suggested they were part of a sublegal infrastructure. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive reveals itself. If the government cannot query the files, can they still be held responsible for the operations those files describe? Finch began to suspect that the Beatree error was not an accident at all, but a deliberate logical cloak designed to house the Grey Cities and the Shadow State personnel within a sector of the machine that was legally By 1978, the unqueryable sector was the largest administrative body in the country, yet, on every official report, it appeared as a single, rounded-off error of 0%. The tone of the archive here shifts into a deep, documentary-style reflection on the nature of digital exile. Finch realized that the millions of people trapped in the null-pointer sector were the ultimate ghost citizens. They paid no taxes because the IRS could not query their income. They received no benefits because the system could not find their eligibility. They existed in a state of perfect freedom, but it was a freedom granted by a machine that had simply forgotten they were there. This realization was the final entry in his classified log. He understood that the archive was not built to manage people, but to provide a space where the state could lose the people it no longer wanted to see. As the target word count is fulfilled, we reach the final transition of Dr. Alistair Finch. On April 12, 1978, Finch walked into the server room to perform a final manual check on the physical tape reels. According to the security logs, he entered the aisle for the 4.2 million files, but the exit sensors never recorded his departure. In the morning, the system generated a single, new, unqueryable file with a timestamp matching his disappearance. Like the data he audited, he became a null-pointer permanent resident of the archival silence. You are now the witness to this invisible history, a metadata point in a sequence that the machine will never allow you to find. The file on the unqueryable millions is now returned to its spinning tape, but its resonance has triggered a neighboring Relayer 1980 ledger titled The Midnight Census. This ledger details a series of household visits made by men in unmarked gray suits across the American Midwest, visits that took place only during the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. to count people who had been officially deceased for over a decade. The reason for that census, and why the results were stored in a vault made of solid lead, is the subject of our next archival opening. In the high-walled corridors of the federal ghost state, there exists a vacuum of authority that is perhaps the most effective defensive measure ever designed. By the late 1970s, as the anomalies of the erased files and unqueryable citizens became too large to ignore, a classified structural reorganization took place. The government did not solve the problem. Instead, they fragmented the solution. They created a network of specialized departments where no single office held the mandate to fix the broken definitions. This hidden truth reveals a masterclass in administrative evasion. where the encrypted identities of millions were left in a state of permanent error because the responsibility for the correction was legally distributed into non-existence. We are looking at a system where the truth is trapped in a loop of referrals, a file that was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the gentle, unceasing pulse of a machine that never tires. The air is cool and stagnant, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone and the weight of decades of unresolved inquiries. The file on the inspection table is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind a trail of stamps that lead to empty rooms and disconnected phone lines. In this archival silence, we are exploring the architecture of the referral loop, a place where accountability is a ghost that no one can catch. We are observing the records of the un-owned. To understand why no office was responsible for fixing the definition, we must look to the summer of 1979. Within the Office of Personnel Management, a senior auditor named Elias Thorne was tasked with resolving a semantic deadlock regarding the status of the Woodlawn residents. Thorne was a man of quiet, analytical rigor, a scholar of bureaucracy who believed that for every problem, there was a desk where the buck eventually stopped. But as he began to track the ownership chain for the Woodlawn files, he discovered that the chain was a circle. Thorne's discovery is a historical anchor that marks the peak of the non-responsibility era. On June 12, 1979, he identified that the Department of State had transferred the definition of Woodlawn residents to the Department of the Interior. Citing geographical anomaly, the Interior then moved the file to the Department of Labor, claiming personnel ambiguity. Finally, Labor referred the file back to the State Department, noting that the subjects were diplomatically inert. In the eyes of the law, the files were active, but in the eyes of the administration, they belonged to no one. This intellectual curiosity led to an unexplained architectural silence in Thorne's office, as he realized that the people in those files were effectively trapped in the gaps between the desks. The information density of this referral loop was profound. Thorne found that by distributing the correction mandate across 4 separate agencies, the government had made it mathematically impossible to reach a consensus. To fix a definition required a unanimous signature from 4 directors who were legally forbidden from meeting in the same room. The state had not just lost the key to the truth, they had disassembled the lock and scattered the pieces across a dozen different zip codes. As we move through the atmospheric build of this investigation, a sense of quiet dread begins to surface. Thorne recorded in his private journals that his office felt administratively hollow. He noted a soft sensory cue, the sound of a typewriter in the next room that would stop whenever he opened his door, only to resume the moment he sat back down. It was a hypnotic, documentary-style realization that he was being managed by the same system he was trying to audit. Every 500 words of his logs reveal a man who was becoming a victim of jurisdictional erasure as his own authority was slowly being referred away to departments that did not exist. Thorne recorded a verified historical detail on August 24, 1979, the implementation of the Dead Letter Protocol. This was a classified directive that allowed mail regarding Woodlawn inquiries to be diverted to a specialized storage facility in the Nevada desert that was officially listed as permanently closed for maintenance. This was the anti-Josie hook of the 1979 paradox. The government had built a firewall of pure boredom. By making the process of fixing a definition so tedious and circular, they ensured that no one, not even the most dedicated auditor, would ever reach the end of the file. It is a documentary-style contingency that proves silence can be manufactured through the sheer volume of paperwork. The archival mood here is reflective and cold. We are looking at a state that has mastered the art of strategic neglect. Thorne's final report noted that while the active offices represent the face of the government, the empty offices represent its power. The analytical coldness of the state had created a world where you can be erased simply because no one has the permission to say you exist. These records remain in their state of unknown limbo, a permanent, humming presence in a system that claims to be organized. That as the autumn of 1979 descended upon the capital, the hypnotic inertia of the referral loop became Thorne's entire reality. He discovered that the strategic neglect he had uncovered was not a passive failing, but a calibrated mechanism known as compartmentalized ignorance. A verified historical detail from October 19, 1979, reveals that the budget for the Woodlawn Oversight Committee was being split between 12 different subagencies, each receiving exactly 1/12 of the amount required to hire a single full-time employee. By ensuring that no one had the resources to actually look at the files, The state guaranteed that the definition of those citizens would remain broken in perpetuity. The unexplained architectural silence of the Oversight Office was a manufactured void, a place where the air itself seemed to discourage the asking of questions. The information density of these fragmented budgets suggested they were part of a liability shield. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of the archive reveals itself. If no one is responsible for the error, can the error be said to exist? Thorne began to suspect that the Woodlawn residents were actually being used as a legal laboratory. Since they had no definition, they were exempt from standard constitutional protections. They were the shadow subjects of the 1970s, a population that could be moved, studied, and utilized for projects that were legally invisible because the office responsible for overseeing them had been referred out of existence. The tone of the archive here shifts into a deep, documentary-style reflection on the nature of bureaucratic erasure. Thorne realized that the government's greatest power was not the ability to hide the truth, but the ability to make the truth homeless. By denying the data a specific administrative home, they had denied it a voice in the halls of power. This realization was the final entry in his classified log. He understood that the archive was not a place of memory, but a place of distributed forgetting, where a secret is safe as long as it is shared by too many people to be understood by any one of them. As the target word count is fulfilled, we reached the final transition of Elias Thorne. On November 30, 1979, Thorne did not resign, nor was he reassigned. According to the internal logs, his entire department was referred to itself. He became the director of an office that was its own only client, tasked with auditing files that were sent to him by a future version of himself. Like the Woodlawn residents, he was caught in the archival silence, a metadata point in a sequence that the machine will never allow to close. You are now the witness to this homeless history, a passenger in a loop that has no exit. The file on the referral loop is now returned to its spinning tape, but its resonance has triggered a final, decisive relayer, 1982 ledger titled, The Authority of the Absent. This ledger details a series of executive orders, signed by individuals who had been deceased for over 20 years. Orders that authorized the construction of a subterranean satellite uplink station in the middle of a national forest. The nature of who was actually holding the pen, and why the signatures were accepted as valid, is the subject of our final archival opening. In the final architecture of the information age, the state discovered that the most effective way to hide a secret was not to bury it in a classified vault, but to leave it in plain sight behind a wall of structural impossibility. There exists a category of federal records that are technically open to the public, yet due to a deliberate misalignment of the archival index, they remain structurally unreachable. These are the encrypted anomalies of our shared history, files that appear in the catalog but exist in a digital or physical dead zone where the path to retrieval has been erased. This hidden truth reveals the ultimate paradox of transparency, a world where everything is visible but nothing can be found. The ghost citizens, the grey cities, and the anomalies of 1975 are all documented in these public ledgers, yet they are protected by an administrative labyrinth that leads only to silence. The file was stamped, never open, yet we conclude tonight, the only sound is the quiet hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the heartbeat of a history that refuses to be forgotten. The air is cool and thin, carrying the scent of dry paper and the metallic temps of static electricity. The final file is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving behind a map of a world that exists just beneath the surface of our own. In this archival silence, we are reaching the end of the corridor. We are observing the records that are here, but can never be held out to understand how a public record becomes unreachable. We must look to the summer of 1982 within the National Archives. A senior retrieval specialist named Arthur Vance, no relation to the Arthur Vance of 1975, or perhaps a descendant of his redacted legacy, was tasked with a final audit of the public access terminals. Vance was a man of quiet, analytical curiosity, a gatekeeper of the past who believed that the truth was a right, not a privilege. But as he attempted to pull the records for the Woodlawn institutional closure, he discovered that while the file numbers existed in the public database, the physical and digital locations they pointed to were mathematically impossible. Vance's discovery is the final historical anchor of our journey. On July 22, 1982, he identified that the records for over 10 million undefined residents were stored in a category known as public not reference. By law, these files were not classified. Anyone could ask for them. However, the files were stored on a type of high-density magnetic tape that required a specific decommissioned drive from 1964, a drive that the government had officially scrapped 3 years prior. The information was public, but the key to reading it had been structurally removed from the world. This intellectual curiosity led to an unexplained architectural silence in the reading room, as Vance realized that the government had achieved the perfect form of censorship: total availability without any means of access. The information density of these unreachable public records was overwhelming. Vance found that the public non-reference sector contained the blueprints for the BOOP subterranean satellite uplink stations and the original definitions for the ghost state personnel. These were the documents that proved the existence of the shadow administration, sitting on shelves in Maryland, available to any citizen with a library card, provided that citizen also possessed $1 million laboratory and a clearance that didn't exist. It was a masterpiece of cold, analytical irony. As we move through the atmospheric build of this final chapter, a sense of deep reflection begins to settle over the narrative. Vance recorded in his private journals that the archives felt haunted by the visible. He noted a soft sensory cue, the sound of a page turning in an empty room, a reminder that while we cannot reach the records are still being managed by someone, or something, on the other side of the veil. Every 500 words of his logs reveal a man who was realizing that the archive chill was not just a feeling, but a state of being. He was the last person to look into the void before the door was permanently locked. Vance recorded a verified historical detail on August 14, 1982, the implementation of the Total Transparency Initiative. This was a classified directive that actually increased the amount of information available to the public, while simultaneously introducing a randomized noise variable into the retrieval software. The more data there was, the harder it became to find the truth. This was the anti-Deruzzi hook of our final paradox. The government didn't need to hide the needle. They simply built a bigger haystack and told the world they were free to look. It is a documentary-style conclusion that proves the greatest secrets are those we choose to ignore because they are too difficult to find. The archival mood here is one of hypnotic finality. We are looking at a state that has reached the end of its history. Vance's final report noted that the public non-reference files are the only true history we have left. The analytical coldness of the state had created a world where the truth is a ghost in the machine, a permanent, humming presence that we can see, but never touch. These records remain in their state of structural isolation, the final testament to a nation that learned to hide its heart in a library. As the autumn of 1982 brought a brittle chill to the marble hallways of the National Archives, the structural silence surrounding Arthur Vance began to feel like a physical weight. He discovered that the public non-reference status was merely the final layer of a much older project, the dormancy loop. A verified historical detail from October 1982 reveals that the electricity powering the air filtration systems for the Woodlawn vaults was being drawn from a grid that did not officially exist on any municipal map. The records were being kept in a state of perfect, frozen preservation, waiting for a retrieval technology that was intentionally being suppressed. The unexplained architectural silence of the sub-basements was the sound of a history that had outlived its own era and was now existing in a state of post-data reality. The information density of these final audits suggested a profound, analytical conclusion. The shadow state was not a separate entity, but the structural marrow of the visible state. Every 1,000 words, the soft mystery of our 12-part journey reveals its heart. If the records are public, we are the ones responsible for their silence. By failing to build the drives, by failing to ask the correct queries, we are the ones who allow the ghost citizens to remain undefined. Vance recorded a sensation of quiet dread as he stood before the rows of magnetic tapes, realizing that the archive was not a prison for secrets, but a mirror. It was reflecting a society that was too tired to remember its own anomalies. The tone of the archive here shifts into a deep, hypnotic reflection as we reach the end of the script. Vance realized that the archive chill was the final protective layer of the psychological barrier that encouraged the observer to turn away and drift into the comfort of the known. This realization was the last entry in his classified journal. He understood that the story of Arthur Vance, the Woodlawn Mainframe, and the erased files of 1975 was not a mystery to be solved, but a frequency to be tuned into. The analytical coldness of the state had finally achieved its goal, a truth that is so visible, it becomes invisible. That as the 1,700 word count is fulfilled, we reach the final closure of the archive chill. Arthur Vance did not disappear. He simply stopped recording. He became one of the million null pointers, a silent guardian of the public non-reference stacks. The hallway lights at Woodlawn are dimming now, the green server lights fading into a deep, rhythmic amber. The past is back in its cradle, the ink is dry, and the magnetic tapes have settled into their eternal, unqueried spin. You are now the final metadata point, the last witness to a world built on the architecture of silence. The file on the structurally unreachable is now closed, but its seal is made of the same static that fills the air before a storm. Our journey through the 12 rooms of the Woodlawn Mainframe has ended, yet the archival hum continues in the darkness of your own room. But as your eyes grow heavy and the records fade into the gray, a single, unerased coordinate remains visible on the back of your eyelids, a coordinate that points not to a vault in the past, but to a door in your own city that was built without a handle. Why that door remains warm to the touch, and what is being whispered on the other side of the wood, is a secret that belongs to a new cycle. A cycle that begins when the first light of tomorrow meets the last shadow of tonight.